Hey folks, I don't know about you, but for me, I pretty much grew up on a staple of good old joysticks, where they primarily look at something like that classic Atari 2600 stick, or messing around with things like the good old Wico Command Control series on Friends' various setups, or of course, as I would in modern times, we yield the good old Zip Stick. An excellent, excellent stick for pretty much everything. But joysticks weren't, of course, how gaming evolved, and of course, what did win out was the humble joypad. And well, one of the things that's always a little surprising is to see that even our good old 8-bit computers got joypads of their own. And so I saw these come up. Saw a pair of these come up a few months ago at a pretty reasonable price, and it is the Cheetah BolliStick. BolliStick. I think ballistic is in a pun on ballistic, which is an ergonomic joystick controller for the serious games player incorporating autofire. And you can sort of see most of it there, and you can sort of see it's a classic fit compatible with. Let's get the angle for that right, so it's readable. Which is of course compatible with your Spectrums, your Commodore computers and video game systems. This has to be post-1990 if it's talking video game systems because of C64GS. Atari computers and video game systems, though I don't think that counts for the dual fire buttons on a 7800. Amstrad computers, most other home computers, older models may require interface and or joystick adapters, not included. So it sort of talks about, unless its features, but we'll cover those as well. Handheld ergon... I'm going to cheat a little here, because I actually bought two. This one's opened. I haven't opened the other one yet, so I'm going to read the side there. Handheld ergonomic design for supreme comfort. 8-position responsive directional control. Ultra-sensitive fire buttons. Auto-fire function. 12-month warranty. Well, I don't think the 12-month warranty is going to apply in Space U 2018, but the rest certainly do. So you can sort of see, really, what the basics of the stick are, of the pad are, I should say. So I'm going to sit down, open this one up, and we'll have a quick look. So, in the box, you get the pad. You get the pad, and sort of feeling there of how it sits. It's very much a different kind of directional stick to what you expect. Like, big thing you can see right away is the actual D-pad is rotated on an angle, not quite 45 degrees, which is kind of interesting. And then you've got twin fire buttons. They're basically like many joysticks, you know, like my Zip Stick, how those fire buttons basically do the same thing, you know, to accommodate different handedness. Those two domes at the tops are meant to be buttons on other variants, but on this variant, they're just, on this one for these machines, it's pretty much nothing. And of course, at the bottom there, you've got an auto-fire switch. And I apologize for this being upside down because I'm on the other side of the camera. So this is going to be upside down while I show you how it sits in the hand. You can sort of see the way it sits in the hand is like that, you know. You can easily hit that pad. And the offset direction actually works very nicely. And of course, because it's a late 80s, early 90s design for home computers popular in the UK, you've got both coloured joystick connectors. The black one is basically your standard Atari 9-pin that'll work on pretty much all of those machines, bar the Spectrums, which is what the grey one comes in for, which is for, of course, your +2 and +3, as the inbuilt ports there are wired to a very different standard, so that you would have to buy those rubbish SJS controllers. But anyway, it's a little smaller than the kind of pad you'd expect. In fact, I don't have something handy that is comparable in size. It's actually a very tiny thing. Build quality feels pretty good. I mean, this one must have been late. Try and get that in camera. I've really got to get an external monitor for filming. But it says QC92, so I'm presuming that this was a very late produced stick or pad. So realistically, you know, by this point, people are getting used to pads playing on their you know, you'd have SNESes and Mega Drives, or Genesis if you don't really respect that original naming. And so, you know, it's something a bit different. Definitely feels, you know, compared to some of the other sticks that Cheetah are notorious for, it's probably not the, probably better than some of them. Anyway, I think it's enough of me waffling with a joystick in front of a camera. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to boot the 64 up, plug it in, play a bunch of games, and I'll tell you about how I think of it, and then we'll come back and sort of wrap things up.
And first on our list is Grand Prix Circuit. Now, Grand Prix Circuit's not quite an arcade racer, but it's not quite as technical as, say, Ferrari Formula 1 or Revs. So it's a good, happy middle ground. And to say things honestly, it's not the best of fits with the BolliStick. I happen to find myself struggling to deal with accelerating and turning corners at the same time. Because, of course, this is the kind of racer where you hit up to accelerate. I found turning corners to be tricky for two reasons. Firstly, the larger than average size of the D-pad meant there was a lot of movement that you needed to do to start turning in the opposite direction. And secondly, this kind of impacted the turning input for the steering wheel, as, like most of Distinctive's other racing games, there's quite a large latency to turn from full turning on one side to turning in the opposite direction. The result being, it was much harder to have a race, and though I managed to finish the race, it wasn't as clean as I would have found had I sat down and played using, say, my trusty zip stick. The next game we're looking at is yet another racer, and it's Hot Rod, the conversion of Sega's arcade game published by Activision. Hot Rod takes things a little differently from other races because it's one of those which is overhead. So an overhead racer kind of means that rather than using up to accelerate, you're holding the fire button and then using left and right movements to steer. I went and picked Hot Rod because it's an example of an overhead racer. There's many of those on the C64, but most of them tend to fit the mold inspired by Super Sprint. Single screen, everything's really small. Hot Rod has nice scrolling tracks, so it gives you a bit more action in its racing. And honestly, this is one of the games that works really well with the BolliStick. Simply because you hold the fire button to accelerate and then press left or right to move. There's no chance of accidentally triggering a diagonal, or having to worry about extra power-ups or things in those directions like with, say, supercars. It's pretty simple, it's pretty straightforward, but everything responded really well here as you're navigating the courses, and I don't really have many complaints about it at all. Hot Rod works excellently here. So let's move on from racing and onto shooting. I mean, you know I'm a big fan of shmups, so it made sense to check some out here. And first off, I'm starting out with Galicia. Probably being one of the more high-profile releases of recent times, but also because it's a game where you really want to pound the fire button. And let's face it, I really found the fire buttons to be quite responsive here. I was able to play pretty darn solidly. Sure, I might not have played long enough to have a serious attempt on my all-time high scores here, but what I did experience when I was playing it was that it worked really well. You don't really have to fight the long travel on the directional pad that much, because you're only moving left and right, and like I've said earlier, the fire buttons were really darn responsive, so I didn't even need to turn on auto-fire. My second shmup pick for this video is good old Enforcer, probably one of my picks for most intense shooter on the C64. Compared to many of its peers, Enforcer is the kind of shmup where you alternate between holding down the fire button to charge your super weapon, but also hitting it quite rapidly for normal shots. And of course, it's no surprise the fire buttons work really well on the BolliStick here. As for the directional inputs, well, the slightly bigger D-pad does mean there's a little bit more thumb movement in moving around, and especially on level 2, I found myself accidentally moving diagonally when I tried to move in a direction. Level 2 is a bigger problem for that, simply because you need to do a lot more precise maneuvering than you have to in the first stage. So, it works with Enforcer, but it could probably be a little tighter, and it would be just right. Now, it's onto platformers, which is another one of those genres that's quite as stable in the C64's library. The first of these I'm going to check out is Creatures 2. I picked this simply because it's a slower paced game focusing on these single screen torture screens over, a lot more frantic action like you'd expect in something like Mayhem in Monsterland. Now, I was expecting this one to play really well here because of these sort of slower movements and jumps, but ultimately it really didn't work out so well for me. I found myself fumbling my jumps constantly, and in the time I spent playing it, grabbing footage, I really didn't have a good time with it. I kind of felt the offset direction of the gamepad really meant I was bouncing around incorrectly when trying to do jumps, and that crossed over even into the intermission screen, which is a simple left-right hold fire to bounce those fuzzies around affair. And yeah, I was kind of a little disappointed that this one just did not work out for me at all, but I guess I'm not surprised because up to jump is the bane of many platforms on the C64. Now, for the second platformer I'm checking out here, time to keep things a little more modern as we check out Sam's Journey, one of the more expansive platformers of the 64 in recent times, and to be honest, this fares a lot better. I think the movement, physics and momentum aren't quite as precise as Creatures, and so being a little looser, it works a little nicer with the gamepad, which is no surprise. Sam's Journey is taking on the console Mario style platform. So here, where it was a little rough in Creatures, it was pretty smooth here. It felt good, and I didn't find myself fumbling with the game quite as much as I did with Creatures. So the looser mechanics of Sam's Journey, they work pretty well here. I still miss having a fire button to jump. In the opening sequence where you're diving into the water, you do use the fire button there, and it felt good, real good. Unfortunately, of course, once you're through that part, you need to use fire to use your special abilities and pick stuff up, so obviously not the case there. But Sam's Journey, it works pretty well. We step away from your conventional platformers to more of an action run-and-gun platformer, and the game we're looking at here is Power Glove. Kind of picked this one because compared to many of its peers, it's a similar experience where you don't really need to focus on excessive blasting, it's more about exploration in the environment. And so firing wise, I think it's pretty much covered. The buttons work really well here for that. I've never really felt like they were a problem. I could quickly hit them, take out enemies, wasn't really a problem. The directional pad, on the other hand, was a little problematic. Partly due to the oversized pad, where I found that quickly changing directions could be a bit fiddly, especially with some jumps. But what I also found here is, I think this is the point where my muscle memory was getting confused, because the offset rotation of the pad meant plenty of times when I was trying to jump, I would sort of flub it up and mess it up. Over time, I didn't really get used to it like I did in other games. Maybe my muscle memory was a bit off, which is a bit of a shame, because I think this kind of game, though it still suffers from up to jump, which again is a known limitation, worked reasonably well. Not quite a strong recommendation, but it worked well enough that I think someone with a bit more time might have been able to get used to it a bit better than I did here. The next one we're looking at is International Karate Plus, which certainly sets up the beat 'em up factor here. And I should admit going in, I'm not the biggest beat 'em up fan, so I'm probably not the best to talk about them. And the thing with International Karate Plus is I kind of picked it over the Fist games because really about the control responsiveness. Fists are a lot more methodical than International Karate is, and I think the more responsive controls here really are a good test of the pad. That being said, I do think it wasn't quite as solid here an experience as I wanted. The inputs, I found myself messing up quite a bit some of the moves. Partly I think it's because my muscle memory is used to a joystick here, and also because the offset rotation on the D-pad does mean that some of those moves could be a little trickier to pull off. But that being said, I think the idea is workable. You do not really need to be doing frantic jumps or things like that like you see in some of the more action-focused games here. So again, this is one I think where with a bit of practice on your end, you could probably adapt to it pretty well. But for me, with the playtime I spent, I didn't quite really find myself adapting to it, and I personally think I'd stick with a joystick here. As we start closing in on the end of this roundup, I went back to a bit of an old favourite, the puzzle game Sensitive. Sensitive is a game where it's really about precise movements done quickly. As you move about each level, you need to be very precise in your movements, and you also need to be very quick. You can't stand on each square for a very long period of time before it blows up and kills you. And what I found here is the pad on the BolliStick works really well. I found I was easily able to just hit the end points of the pad, despite the larger size, very easily, very quickly, and with my muscle memory on solving those levels in the past, I found I was just really able to play it incredibly smoothly. Sensitive is a bit of a simple game compared to the others I'm covering here, but in all honesty, it's one where the pad is incredibly suited, works incredibly well, and I found I had a most excellent time revisiting it as a result. I wouldn't be lying if I thought this was quite the best game that I've covered here in terms of how well it works with the pad, which really surprises me, that's for sure. And so, we come to the final game I'm looking at in this video, and that is isometric platform 'em up head over heels. I hadn't originally planned to look at this, but when I posted a photo of the BolliStick online, another creator got in touch and said, it looks like it's designed for those isometric games, and so it made sense to put it on. And you know what? It works really darn well. Like in Sensitive, it's the kind of game where you have slower, more deliberate movements, and that works really well with the pad. On top of that, the rotation of the D-pad is perfect in translating the movements. You're not pretending to rotate your joystick and move that awkwardly. The natural rotation happens, and as a result, you can easily move about. It also means that when handling some of the trickier moves, like for example that jump in head's first room where you get the extra lives, they come naturally and movements respond great. You don't need to hammer the fire button with head over heels, it's really just a simple press every now and then to jump. But it honestly works so great here that the game is perfectly suited for it.
So there is the BolliStick. Now you can sort of see the kind of games it worked really well at and kind of games it didn't. And I guess realistically, you're always going to be limited with this kind of device on these 8-bit games because a lot of them, relying on that single fire button means you can't, you don't have a separate fire button for jump like you would on a console, where it makes platforms a little more challenging to play. And personally, I think I much prefer a good comfy stick. I mean, like I said, my stick of choice, my controller of choice these days is my zip stick. That's what I usually play stuff on, and you would hear that in the background of many a video as I'm filming. So the BolliStick, I mean, I didn't pay an excessive amount for it, and I was just curious, which is why I grabbed it. I don't think it's worth going out of your way, but if you spot one at a reasonable price, yeah, why not? Play something a little differently. Like, I found it really good with certain kinds of games, like puzzlers and games where it's a little slower pace. Like Head Over Heels was amazing with it. In fact, I actually didn't have that on my list until, I took a snap and someone made a comment about it. So, but yeah, it feels really good for an isometric game. It feels good for puzzlers and games where you're only moving in two directions. Yeah, it works great. I don't think it's going to replace the zip stick as my default control, but hey, there's many more options out there. And this one I thought was a bit of a curio, so I'm actually going to leave it there. I think I've spoken long enough about a gamepad that's 20 odd years old. So as always, thank you all very much for watching.